certificates afterwards.
This meeting is being recorded.
That's what I mean. And also we distribute certificate for those who need certificates, and I think there will be announcement how you ask certificates later. And this webinar also realized as a team work. So we have Anita Halim in Makassar, who also helps to run this webinar, and Gadis Fitriana Putri in Amsterdam, who also, and of course Melo with his team in Museum Schip. We will start our webinar. First is with Frans Ledemeyer, who will start with sharing his thought and his ideas or his visions about these issues, Indonesia and Amsterdam School from east to the west, through a film. So we will watch a film from Frans Ledemeyer. Please.
...350 jaar was Indië Nederlands bezit. En pas aan het eind van de 19e eeuw kreeg men hier belangstelling voor de cultuuruitingen van de kolonie. Die belangstelling kan niet losgezien worden van de groeiende interesse in Europa voor niet-westerse culturen, waardoor het Japonisme en het Orientalisme konden ontstaan. Mijn grote passie is de vroeg 20e eeuwse toegepaste kunst en architectuur in Nederland. Ook wel bekend onder de stijlnamen Nieuwe Kunst, Amsterdamse School, Art Deco en Nieuwe Zakelijkheid. En vooral als die beïnvloed zijn door de Indonesische cultuur. Dat heet dan kruisbestuiving. En die kruisbestuiving past helemaal bij mijn biculturele identiteit. Rond 1900 was er in Nederland een grote interesse in de boeddhistische en hindoeïstische tempels op Java, zoals de Borobudur en de Prambanan. En het is daardoor dat er in de toegepaste kunst motieven uit die religies worden gebruikt. De hoofdingang van het gebouw de Basel wordt geflankeerd door 2 vrouwenfiguren van Mendes da Costa, Insulinde en Europa, metaforen voor de gekoloniseerde en de kolonisator. Gebouw de Basel werd tussen 1919 en 1926 gebouwd in opdracht van de Nederlandse Handelmaatschappij. Het exterieur is volgens theosofische beginselen ontworpen met gebruik van meanderpatronen, afgeleid van de grondvorm van de tempel de Borobudur. Door de donkere en lichtgekleurde horizontale lagen aan de buitenkant werd dit gebouw ook wel de spekkoek genoemd. Boven de ingang van het safe deposit is een kalakop, een monster, die net als boven de ingang van een Hindoe-Javaanse tempel het kwaad buiten de deur moet houden. We zijn hier bij het woonhuis, voormalig woonhuis en architectenbureau van Eduard Cuypers. En op zijn architectenbureau, dan kan je zeggen, dat is de kraamkamer geweest van de Amsterdamse School. Daar werkten Michel de Klerk, Johan van der Meij en Piet Kramer. Hij heeft ervoor gezorgd dat hij door zijn goede contacten in Nederlands-Indië een tijdschrift uitgaf, Nederlands-Indië oud en nieuw. Het voormalige scheepvaarthuis uit 1916, nu Grand Hotel Amrâth, is het eerste grote gebouw in de expressionistische Amsterdamse schoolstijl. Ontworpen door Johan van der Meij, geassisteerd door Michel de Klerk en Piet Kramer. Op een betonnen sklet werden verschillende soorten baksteen op een expressieve en decoratieve manier gemetseld. Het werd een gesamtkunstwerk, waarbij architectuur, beeldhouwkunst en toegepaste kunst één geheel vormen. Bovenop het dak aan de achterzijde zijn aan weerszijden 2 stupa's te zien. In 1595 vertrok van deze plek Cornelis de Houtman naar Bantam op Java en dat markeert het begin van de kolonisatie van Indië. De grote glas in loodkap met afbeeldingen van de wereldzeeën en dierriemtekens is van de glazenier Willem Bochtman. Het was een kantoor voor 6 rederijen. De versieringen aan ex en interieur zijn een ode aan de zeevaart en de overzeese geschiedenis door de eeuwen heen. Ik ben op het spoor gebracht op de invloed van de Indonesische cultuur op architectuur en toegepaste kunst. Vooral van de Amsterdamse School, door artikelen geschreven door Nederlandse kunsthistorici zoals Hanneke Olieslager. En later is daar Frans van Burkel bijgekomen. En dat is een ware eye-opener voor me geweest. Bijvoorbeeld dit eerste blok van Michel de Clercq. Hij kreeg die opdracht van Klaas Hille. En dan zie ik, als ik naar boven kijk, zie ik een paraboolvorm. Naar mijn mening en ook naar de mening van toch die kunsthistorici die ik net genoemd heb, is dat beïnvloed door het blad van de lotusbloem of door de vorm van een stupa van de Borobudur. Dit requisiet heet een gunungan of een kayon. Stelt u zich voor in het midden onder de lotusstam. Dan de 2 deuren die leiden naar de hemelpoort. En dan de kluiten, dat zijn de kluiten van de boom. En de tong van de kalakop. En in het midden het trappenhuis, het massieve van de berg. Dat allemaal in de gevel van het tweede blok van Michel de Clercq, 1917-1918 gebouwd. Het derde woonblok, gebouwd 1917 tot 1921, daar is de hoofdvorm geïnspireerd op een djempana. Dat is een Balinese draagstoel. Die is in 1900 door de Nederlandse regering in opdracht uitgevoerd door Balinese snijders. En die heeft op de tentoonstelling 1900 in Parijs gestaan. In 1915 was er ook weer een tentoonstelling in het Stedelijk Museum over Balinese hedendaagse Hindoeïstische kunst. En daar heeft Michel de Clercq die draagstoel gezien en is daardoor geïnspireerd geraakt. Die draagstoel is vuurverguld en hij heeft de Groningse baksteen uitgezocht, die oranjekleurige, om die goudkleur te benaderen. En aan die djempana zijn aan weerszijden 2 naga's. En die naga's die vind je terug als schoorstenen op dit derde blok. En de golvende rand, dat is dus het lijf van die naga. Op het dak van die djempana was een boeket met lotusknoppen. En de lotusknop die hier dus achter mij staat, dat is geïnspireerd op die boeket lotusknoppen. In 1921 kregen Michel de Clercq en Piet Kramer de opdracht om dit woonblok neer te zetten. Sociale woningbouw van woningbouwvereniging De Dageraad. Vooral de hoekbebouwingen van Piet Kramer zijn spectaculair. Die golvende lijnen zijn geïnspireerd op Hindoeïstische tempelarchitectuur. En het zijn eigenlijk arbeiderspaleizen. Dat wilde het socialistisch woonbestuur om arbeiderspaleizen te maken. Ook bijzonder zijn de 2 sculpturen, Vishnu en Garuda. Vishnu symboliseert de zonsondergang. Hij heeft zijn ogen naar beneden geslopen en hij heeft met zijn rechterhand houdt hij zijn hart vast. En Garuda kijkt omhoog, symboliseert de zonsopgang en is het oosten. Die daken die in puntvormen eindigen, dat is geïnspireerd op de Minangkabau. En als we dan weer verder lopen, zien we een soort scheepsboeg met daaraan ramen in de vorm van Indonesische prauwen.
Prauwen. Oh ja.
Dit is de eerste brug die Piet Kramer, esthetisch adviseur bij de gemeente Amsterdam, mocht bouwen. Er zullen er vele volgen. Hij deed dat in samenwerking met Hildo Krop, die beeldhouwwerk voor zijn rekening nam. Opvallend zijn de twee brughuisjes die door die markante vormen die zijn afgeleid van stupa's van de Borobudur. En in stupa's worden relieken van boeddhistische heiligen bewaard. Een belangrijke inspiratiebron voor de Amsterdamse school is de architectuur van de Minangkabau. De Minangkabau die zaten dus in Zuid-Sumatra. We hebben dat gezien in de architectuur in Amsterdam, maar ook in de toegepaste kunst. In de meubels, maar ook in het klokje. En wat is nou wat zo kenmerkend is van de Minangkabau-architectuur? Dat is het dak wat dan zo naar voren buigt. Dat zie je dus ook heel goed in dit klokje.
Thank you very much, Frans, for the film. And although Frans is very famous in the Netherlands, but probably it's nice to know, especially for those who do not know Frans, that he is born in Bandung actually in 1942. So he can say
Paris of
Bandung. Okay. And then in 1951, he with his family moved to the Netherlands. So the film that you have seen is the recently made documentary films with B. Moose about cross-pollinations, Indonesia and the Netherlands. In daily lives, he is an art dealer, appraiser, curator, author, and consultants related to the Indonesian art. So Frans, we are going to explore more during the discussions, but probably for now, you have something to say a little bit about this film or about Amsterdam School, just briefly. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I was gladly surprised that the Indonesian culture had such a big influence on the Amsterdam School. I was there was an eye-opener for me because there were two art historians who wrote about it, and that was now I have to look at the name. It's a woman, Hanneke Olieslager, and then afterwards Frans van Burkum, who investigated a lot of it, and I lean on what they have found out, and I was really very surprised about it. And I'm proud because I come from Indonesia. So I think,
Yes.
look what Indonesians have done. And you can see it when you look around here in Amsterdam, especially in the social housing area.
Yes.
And that's what I wanted to expose to people, that people can look at it. And you know, in the past I gave a lot of lectures all over the Netherlands, and everybody said they were so surprised. They say it's really new for us. We didn't know that. So.
Thank you. We look forward to explore more during the discussions. And then the second speaker, we are going to have Dr. Sadiah Bonsra. So she's combining her experiences in academic research, curation, public programming, and producing Sadiah works to decolonize colonial and contemporary Indonesian history, heritage, and art. So basically, Sadiah is a perfect combination of academics and field works. She has a lot of experience either in literature, but also she knows what's going on the field. She is based in Jakarta as a historian and curator, and she has a lot of important other positions which she can explore more, or you can ask also later during the discussions, but very interesting. And I think Sadiah will also start her presentations by showing you a video. Please go ahead, Sadiah.
Thank you so much, Hasti. And I think Mela will now help me with playing the video.
Mela, we need a voice. The voice.
Still no sound.
Mela.
Where is Mela?
Well, I think he's busy. It's okay. Sometimes this thing happens, so we all know. So while we are waiting for Mela, probably how many of you have been to the exhibitions in Museum Skips, especially for those who are in the Netherlands? Oh, Mela is ready. Okay, you can tell me later during the discussions.
Still no sound, Mela.
Oh,
let's see. Is this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That we hear.
Sounds,
Yes.
How I'm thinking about wayang
is
is
yours-
wayang as a performance.
yes.
Is also vision?
You
Yes, we
don't
hear
see the
this.
video.
And you see it as well?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Practice that has been a
Yes.
Yes. All
Yes.
right.
Yes.
There we go.
how I'm thinking about wayang is wayang as a performance practice that has been around for a really long time, since the 9th century until the present. It's still very much alive. And I see it as a storytelling practice. It's not just a shadow puppet theater and where there's the play of light and shadow, but it exists in very many different forms. Gradually, with the discovery of the Hindu-Buddhist roots of wayang, the perception of wayang started to change. So it's interesting that at first the documentation was really used with the idea if the Dutch would understand the Javanese culture and the nature of the people better, it would also give them better tools to control them better and therefore also exploit the Indonesian archipelago in a better way or a more efficient way. The elements of the mystical, the philosophical were already emphasized since the 1920s, especially since the 1930s, in this consolidation of what wayang was as a static performance practice. So it was thought to be static. It was thought to be never changing. It was thought to be having been delivered to the early 20th century straight from the 9th century. So people, especially Dutch people, thought it had never changed. And that also suited the idea of the larger Indonesian archipelago of not having been changed since back in the day. So at the time, this obsession almost with the mystical had also roots in the Orientalist way of thinking. So that kind of like thinking still continues to influence our understanding, both in the Netherlands and Indonesia today, about different elements of wayang and what can be learned by foreigners or Europeans, and what remains inaccessible and so-called purely Javanese.
Thank you very much for the film. And now you are going to share your presentations, please.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Hasti, and thank you so much, Mela, for helping with the video. Like I also always have like issues like that, so I'm glad that you helped out with that. Thank you so much for having me at Museum at Schip and Hasti and for organizing this webinar. It's really great to be here and to see so many friends, both from the Netherlands as in Indonesia. As Hasti said, like today, I showed the video to give you a little bit of a sort of like an introduction into the topic that I would like to speak about. So the full video, which is a little bit longer than what you just saw, is also on show at in the exhibition at Museum Schip at the moment. But of course, since it's part of an exhibition, it's always supposed to be short, right? So today I have the opportunity to talk a little bit more and to explain a little bit more about the research that I've done on which the video is based. So basically I looked into the wayang performance practice. So I specifically don't call it a tradition because tradition, in my view, is also a concept that was invented by the colonizers to render indigenous cultures as static and as ahistorical, and therefore also as a sort of like a lesser culture as opposed to European or Dutch culture. So that's why I explicitly call wayang, but also, for example, dance or any performance practice, I call it a practice and not a tradition, because it's still being practiced today and also still being practiced tomorrow, and probably also still being practiced next year and in the coming years. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the reception and the discourse about wayang, especially in the Netherlands. So here I would like to share my screen with you. So we will start here. So for me, maybe I just go back still. For me, the interesting thing, or at least something that we need to realize, is that, as I explained in the video, for example, there is already evidence of the existence of wayang since the 9th and 10th century. But the interesting thing is that we actually don't really know that much about the form of wayang, or the role or the position that wayang played in Javanese communities before the 19th century. So our whole understanding, our whole idea of what wayang is and how it has developed and how it has shaped is very much connected with the colonial moment. So that is an important thing, I think, to realize. It is really in the 19th century that Europeans from a European viewpoint started to dig into or attempt to understand what wayang actually is. So I distinguish three periods during the colonial period. So the first period, I see largely the whole of the 19th century, in which Europeans, so mainly the Dutch, but also, for example, the British through Raffles, for example, try to understand wayang. What is it? How should they interpret it? How should they understand it? The second period takes place, is happening during the first 2 decades during the 20th century, in which this whole idea or the understanding of wayang is being reevaluated. And it starts, the meaning of wayang or the understanding of wayang starts to change towards the end of the 19th century. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, that idea becomes really consolidated, and it becomes codified and also preserved in attempts by the courts, the Javanese courts in particular. So one of the earliest accounts that we have are, or descriptions, written accounts, are from Thomas Stamford Raffles. So during the British period, 1811 to 1816, Raffles was here in Indonesia, and then he wrote the history of Java. And there, for example, he says, the interest excited by such spectacles connected with national recollection is almost inconceivable. The eager multitude will sit listening with rapturous delight and profound attention for whole nights to these rude dramas. So this is a description by Raffles, but it's also at the same time a judgment. So in his eyes, these dramas, the rude dramas, that is what wayang is. And he's really impressed by the great interest that is there, but to him, it's rude. So it's not sophisticated, it's not refined, as opposed to European performance practices. So if we, 3 decades later, there is an early account from a Dutchman, Wilkens, who published for the first time a Javanese text of wayang with a Dutch translation. And also in his eyes, wayang was merely like a folk entertainment, and as an art form, it was really useless in his mind. But the only value that it had, we can see here. So Wilkens writes, he who wants to assess the value of the wayang play in comparison with our drama performances in the Netherlands will not find anything that is worth watching. However, he who wishes to get to know the Javanese people from up close will find the wayang performances will serve as an excellent way to characterize the Javanese people. So what he is saying is that basically there is no value in wayang, except that is really a really good way to understand the nature of the Javanese people, or how Javanese people are. So there's already a relationship with the Javanese people. Then there is another Dutchman who wrote in the 1870s, already a bit later, and he also looks at wayang. While he recognized the knowledge that is sort of embedded in the wayang, which his predecessors Raffles and Wilkens did not, he does not see any development in the wayang. So he writes, for example, but what is it? There's no progress, there's no development in the art. Once understood, once figured out, having come to grips, and once it's finished for the rest of his or her life. One will not know of new plays or rehearsals. It is not a science, but more a skill or an ability, and playing the wrong tone every once in a while, well, it is not very much of an issue. So here you also feel like a very denigrating attitude towards Wayang. He doesn't really appreciate what it is, and he doesn't see any progress or development in the art of Wayang. So in this early period in which the Dutch people started to document Wayang performances, what happened is that they really had a disdain for indigenous Javanese culture. But they thought that it would contain knowledge about the Javanese people that was helpful in being able to control and to rule, and therefore also better to exploit Java and also the rest of the Indonesian archipelago. So the way in which Wayang was described was in a way in dichotomy. So Wayang was everything that Europe was not, or it was everything that the Netherlands was not. But Wayang was considered as the essence of Javanese people and as a mirror of their nature. Then later, towards the end of the 19th century, we see a shift in this thinking. So at first, everyone was very sort of negative about Wayang. It has no value, it's worthless. But then towards the late 19th century, this starts to shift. And this happens under the influence of the roots of the Indian stories. So at first, actually, lots of Dutch people actually did not view the Indian origin. So for example, they thought that Wayang was developed separately from, for example, shadow theaters in India or Chinese shadow theater. And a lot of Dutch people towards the end of the century still believed in this way. Like they thought it was just a Javanese invention in a way, a Javanese, in their view, a tradition. But gradually, the Indian Hindu-Buddhist roots of Wayang were discovered and also accepted. And gradually what we see here, so this is Hazel, who writes towards the end of the century, 1897. And he too thinks of Wayang as the nature of the Javanese people. That is the first quote. It reveals their ways of thinking, their ideals, and their interests, etc. In one word, the nature of the Javanese people. But he also says this. He also sees that the Wayang performance was part of the ancestral ritual. If the shadow performance was one of the constituent parts of the ancestral ritual, the performer, the dalang, or the puppeteer, was the priest of the cult. So here we see a new element, namely the idea that Wayang was actually a part of an ancestral ritual. So that's something new that comes up towards the end of the 19th century. So what we see then is that over the course in the early 20th century, we see an emerging sense also of Javanese cultural nationalism, which coincided with a spread of theosophy. And this is also something that I think the exhibition raises. The theosophy was a religious movement that originated actually in 1875 in America, but also very quickly spread to Europe and Australia, for example. And within the theosophy, theosophy linked the East to the West in its teachings. So it mixed several world religions, such as Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, in a very harmonious blend. That was actually the theosophical worldview. But the theosophical worldview, it also favored pre-Islamic Hindu and Buddhist teachings. So this is very much in line with like the discovery of the Hindu-Buddhist roots of Wayang, that also theosophy became an influence in the way in which Wayang was perceived. The interesting part is also that also young Indonesians or young Javanese who had enjoyed European style education also came into contact with theosophy. So it's not just the Dutch, but also in Indonesia that people came in touch with theosophy. And for these young Javanese, what was interesting about theosophy was that it really respected so-called Eastern cultures and philosophies. So that is the reason why many nationalists in the early 20th century actually came under influence of theosophical thinking. In the Netherlands, Dutch theosophists described the so-called East as sensitive, mysterious, pure, and contemplative. And this became sort of like also connected to what Wayang was. So what we see here is that theosophy also understood Wayang as an essential element of Javanese life, as an idea that already developed during the 19th century, but this time also in connection with this idea of the ancestral ritual. Theosophy also saw that Wayang contained a higher knowledge, some form of higher knowledge that that was inaccessible to Europeans, but only understandable and only accessible to Javanese people. So in this sense, under influence of theosophy, the discourse of Wayang, or the way in which people who talk about Wayang or write about Wayang, document Wayang, had become really an Orientalist subject. Wayang had become the essence of the Javanese. It reflected both their history, but also their ungraspable soul. And writings of Wayang, which were embedded in this European knowledge system, also influenced Javanese ideas of Wayang, to which also the Javanese elite anticipated. So with this, I mean, is that there was an exchange of thinking. So it was not just a one-way road. It was not just the Dutch projecting things onto Wayang, but the Javanese also played with these elements that were assigned to Wayang, the mystical, the philosophical, etc., and then also positioned it as something that was inaccessible for Europeans. It was something that was only accessible for Javanese. So we see here that this was an exchange of thinking in which both the Dutch and the Javanese created ways of thinking about Wayang in a dialogue. So what we then see is that the discourse of Wayang as the essence of the Javanese resulted in the idea of a sort of like the idea that there was a so-called pure form of Wayang. And this is what the Javanese elite actually appropriated. So to them, it was a way to claim Wayang actually as a Javanese culture. And the Javanese elite used it to articulate a world of difference. So they used it to create a Javanese identity, and which was fundamentally different from the Dutch. So this is a quote from Mangkunagara VII in 1933. So he writes, this is actually from a speech that he gave, the Wayang is not merely a play or entertainment, but rather a reflection of the spiritual life and soul of an entire people. This is why the Wayang stories are the accounts of a very special and highly developed society. So we see here that sort of like these discourses about ritual, philosophy, the mysticism is being appropriated by the Javanese elite to highlight the development of Javanese society. So with this idea of the understanding that there once was a highly developed society, or the Javanese really are, there is also the idea of a pure Wayang. There should be something as a pure Wayang, but what that is actually always remained undefined. What is the pure Wayang was very hard to grasp, but in order to be able to preserve the pure Wayang, the courts, for example, established educational courses for puppeteers, where they could learn about the Wayang and where Wayang performances were codified and standardized. So in that period, and that's why I call it preservation and codification, this idea of like an original Wayang, something that was ahistorical and static, was already started to being preserved and being codified in the period of the 1920s and 1930s. The interesting thing also with this standardization of Wayang performances and the rules that were made up for educating the puppeteers also worked in a way that was denying development in performances, out of fear that Wayang would derive or would even move away even further from its origins. So this search for restoration also really implied like a search for originality and authenticity and the presumption of a cultural peak that had long been gone. So now I want to show you some pictures. So this is a sort of like the discourse that developed over the 19th and early 20th century. And I wanted to show you also some images of how wayang was being photographed. So this is from an image in the Tropi Museum of wayang. You can see it on the, sort of like the left side of the image that wayang was on display in Batavia in 1883. Then we see another, this is a room at the Batavia's Genootschap, also here in Jakarta in 1896, so a little bit later. So here we see wayang puppets hanging on the wall on the left-hand side. And here we see the reading room in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1915. So here we also see wayang puppets at the back of the photo of the photograph. And on the right-hand side, and this is interesting, we see an interpretation of a wayang show. So we see a screen with shadow puppets set up against the screen and a mannequin that has been set up to represent a puppeteer. So as if he's playing an actual wayang performance. This is another picture from an exhibition now in Copenhagen, but it's still it's a Dutch submission to an exhibition in Copenhagen in 1922. So what you see here is very similar to the installation that we saw at the Stedelijk. So also a screen set up with wayang puppets against it, as if it's a wayang show, but in a real wayang show, the puppets would never be stacked on top of each other like that on the left-hand side. And also here we see two mannequins, again representing a dalang, in a way to sort of mimic how a wayang show is being performed in Indonesia. Then this is the last slide that I wanted to show. So this is a wayang display. The picture is from 1935, but this was the exhibition as shown here. So again, we see a flat screen with wayang puppets set up against the screen, but again with sort of like smaller scenes on the higher end of the screen that you would not see in an actual wayang performance. But in front of the screen, we see another mannequin giving us the impression, or giving the viewer the impression that they're actually watching a setup of a wayang show. So the interesting thing of this is that we see that the way in which wayang was presented is very consistent already from these very early images from the late 19th century until the early 20th century. And the interesting thing of this exhibition, for example, at the Tropi Museum, so the Colonial Institute became then later the Tropi Museum. So this exhibition was opened in 1926 and it remained unchanged until the late 1950s. So what that means is that this whole idea of wayang as a pure performance practice, as something ahistorical, as something unchanged, with these values of mysticism and philosophy, really became sort of also very static in museum presentations. So the whole image of wayang basically did not change since the early 20th century until like the mid 20th century, which consolidated ideas of what wayang should be, Orientalist ideas of what wayang is and what it should be, and also communicated that in through these exhibitions to the larger Dutch audience. So I think that is what I would like to share for today. And if you have any questions, then I'd be happy to respond. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Sadia, and welcome to everyone who just joined the webinar. And nice to have you. And for all of you, please write down your questions, your input, feedback, or if you have additional informations, please write down in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And before I start, apologize. discussions, I would like to ask Anita if you have announcement related to the exhibitions.
Yes, thank you, Mbak Hasti. So I have announcement. So I would like to ask our audience here today to be actively participate in our next webinar with the topic of Amsterdam School in Indonesia. Our exhibition at the museum has highlighted the works of architects and artists like Kosman Citroen, Lim Buanji, and Hendrik van der Einde. However, because of the relatively low exposure of Amsterdam School in Indonesia, we are sure that more buildings and structures are yet to be discovered. So we would like to invite you all to join our search by sending us some pictures of Amsterdam School influenced art and architecture in Indonesia. And you could do that by tagging our Instagram. It's at Amsterdam School in Indonesia and using the hashtag of the same name, Amsterdam School in Indonesia. And for the best image, there will be a prize that will be sent directly from Museum Head Schip in Amsterdam. And so please don't wait to send us the image because we will announce the winner next month in our third webinar. And I will also put the hashtag and the Instagram account on the chat box. So thank you, Mbak Hasti.
Thank you very much, Anita, one of the volunteers who helped the exhibitions in the Museum Head Schip. So now we are entering the discussions until 2 o'clock, until 3 o'clock Amsterdam time, Dutch time, and 9 o'clock in the evening Indonesian time. I apologize if I have once a while has to, yeah, okay. I would like to come back to Frans and Sadia after seeing the videos and also listening to the presentations. And probably that can trigger more questions or opinions from the public about interactions, because at the second webinar, we focus on the influence of Indonesia to the Netherlands from the east to the west. So, Frans.
Yes, I see one chat.
Yes. I will come back to you to chat, but I will start with the questions for you, and also for Sadia later. The same questions about how much the Dutch artists or experts which you show in your video and presentations adjust the originality from Indonesia itself into their inspirations or creative thinking. How this active interactions in your opinion happen? Is that completely 100% freedom that they apply, or they
What do you mean by freedom?
as originally as possible?
No, they are inspired by it, so they don't copy it. They changed it a bit. You can see the resemblance, but it's not really a copy of it.
Okay.
And what you mean by freedom?
Yeah, I mean it's about ownerships, about having inspirations from someone else's culture.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm inspired by something in the Netherlands, and I will create something completely new.
But that's already happened through the ages already. Like the Delft pottery is inspired by Chinese porcelain. You know, when they take over the inspiration and they change it and they are just inspired by it, and it gives a new specimen. It's like a fusion. It's like also food. You can also make Chinese food with Western food or Indonesian food and make a fusion of it, and it makes something original. It's not a copy of it.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I like it.
You like it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is the part of this woke history that cultural appropriation is coming up these days.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And Sadia, do you have opinion about this?
Yeah, I was going to bring up actually the notion of cultural appropriation, because I think it's a fine line. Like on the one hand, I do feel, of course, cultural exchange has always happened, and things like this happen in a very intangible way, right? It happens very fluidly. People see something and they are inspired by something and then translate it into into their own language. I do feel like we have to take into consideration that at this time, the power relationships between the Netherlands and Indonesia were not equal. It was an unequal power relationship. So therefore, also the exchange of culture happened along these lines of unequal infrastructure. So I do think that's something that we have to consider by thinking of like, how were they inspired? It's also the cultural appropriation discussion is also very much about like, to what extent is one, you know, entitled, or would someone be entitled to use someone else's culture? So I do feel, you know, there's something more to explore that there, although, yeah, on the one hand, probably a lot of artists were genuinely inspired by Indonesian artists, but that was made possible because of these unequal infrastructure. So it was made possible because they were able to travel to Indonesia, for example, because of the colonial infrastructure that existed, because of the wealth
Most
that
of them
the
didn't have.
Netherlands had gathered, and were able to go to the Netherlands, to go to Indonesia. So I do think it's something to take into account for sure.
But most of them didn't travel to Indonesia.
Yeah, so that is also an interesting thing, actually, because
They
Hazu, one of the
exhibitions.
Sorry,
They saw
Frans.
exhibitions. They saw that exhibitions in the Netherlands, and they treated with respect, you know. And I think that was the First World War when Amsterdam School was originated, and I think they used also the peace and the freedom symbolism of the Hindu and Buddhistic religion, so to put it in their creations, to give the people here to say, look, there will be peace after the war. Holland was neutral, but they also were also they felt this threat of the war. So I think they did it well, these architects and artists. You can't blame them for cultural appropriation.
Thank you very much, friends. Nevertheless, I think we are open to all opinions, and I think new angles about how we look at the history and the interactions is interesting, and also open up ideas. So I think I welcome also the angles which Sadia mentioned, which I think the audience also. Otherwise, you could share your opinions about it. We also would like, especially to hear.
I also can defend it.
Yes. We would like also to hear the opinions about the Indonesians join this webinar. How they think that their cultures are adapted in the Netherlands. So please share with it. And meanwhile, we have questions for Sadia. Could you share a little bit about the perceptions towards wayang or ethnographic art in general, both with the contemporary Dutch and Indonesian society? Has much changed since the third paradigm shift to about 1945, in your opinion? Please, Sadia. And I think for those who do not speak up, would you mind to mute your volume, please? Yeah. Thank you. Sadia, please go ahead with the questions.
Okay, so what is my idea about wayang, or more towards so-called ethnographic art in general, both with the contemporary Dutch and Indonesian society? Has much changed? Actually, I was thinking about this question the other day, but more from like the perspective of contemporary art, and why, for example, contemporary Indonesian art or modern Indonesian art, for example, also is present in the collections of Tropen Museum, mainly firstly collected through these colonial infrastructures. So I do feel that, for example, in the Netherlands, a lot of things that is associated with Indonesia, for example, wayang, or maybe even, well, I think less and less, increasingly less contemporary Indonesian art, that is now being viewed as actual contemporary Indonesian art. So I do feel there is a shift from this thinking of so-called ethnographic way of looking at Indonesian cultural expressions towards an appreciation for contemporary Indonesian arts. But I do feel when it comes to performing arts, for example, last year I produced a work for Eko Supriyanto, a dancer and choreographer in Solo. We created a new work called Ibu Ibu Belu, Bodies of Borders, with 6 dances from Belu in NTT. And we brought it to Spring Festival in Utrecht, a dance festival, and also 2 other festivals in Germany. And there, for example, I do notice that it's quite hard to talk about a piece that is very much rooted into local dance practices, how to explain that and how to be able to make that accessible for Dutch audiences without falling into the trap of like colonial terminology and colonial way of thinking. So I do feel it's still very present in Dutch or European society at large, but there's also at the same time a shift happening, especially I think with younger generations that have a bigger sensibility towards the difficult past of colonial history.
Adis, are you satisfied with that? I want to explore more with Sadiah about what is the shift that you mentioned just now that is now happening, especially with the younger generations.
Yeah, I think, for example, like how during the pandemic, there was the Black Lives Matters movement. So things like that really help to shift discourses or our way of thinking and perception of the world. I think also the younger generations by now, I mean, also Amsterdam, right? It's now, how do you say that? Like largely a multicultural society, basically. So it's kind of like we cannot deny any longer that being mixed or being interracially or being of another cultural origin or ethnicity is just part of reality today. And I think the younger generations are increasingly also really aware of these unequal power balances that have been created during the colonial period, but are still very much intact. And they just no longer accept the inequality and being treated as a second-rank citizen, for example. So that is, I think, slowly, I think, what you see also in public discussions, public opinions, that is slowly shifting. That is hopeful, but at the same time, you also see, people who have a harder time to like go with the flow and go with the shift. Yeah. So you see both dynamics, I think.
Thanks. Adis, would you like to comment, or are you satisfied with the answers?
I can say I'm very satisfied with the answer. I do relate very much with Sadia's comment about how the newer generation have quite a different take on how we perceive and articulate these heritage objects and the so-called ethnographic materials. So yeah, for now, looking forward to hearing more discussion on this.
It's echoing, but I hope Sadia could understand what he said. Thank you, Sadia. And there are questions from Max Meyer. Max, if you would like to say directly, please go ahead. It's nice sometimes to have human contact. And maybe please introduce yourself a little bit because there are many participants here, please.
Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Sadia and Frans, for your introduction. I'm Max Meyer, and I'm a consultant to museums in the Netherlands and also in Indonesia as well. And I am a bit of a fly on the wall on this Berlage, the Nusantara project. So I'm not involved in that, but my wife is. And in that respect, I wondered, when I went to the exhibition, I asked myself how got those artists and those architects in the Netherlands got their information from Indonesia. And then I read that most of them went to the world exhibitions like in Amsterdam and Brussels and so on. But as a fact of matter, they are colonial products, more or less censored by the colonizer. So how open was the real connection between artists in the Netherlands and architects and artists, so to call, in Indonesia? Since I can imagine that many people, officials in the Netherlands, were more or less restricted to have a kind of open conversation with counterparts in Indonesia. But I could imagine that artists could get over this colonial red line, so to say. Well, I can say more about that, but I just wondered, are there any sources or data available of these kind of contexts? I know, of course, the diaries, and of course also the diary of the travel diary of Berlage, but there is no Indonesian source mentioned. He doesn't really comment on meeting any Indonesians. So for me, I had the impression that he stayed within his colonial white bubble, so to say. It is a bit blunt as I express myself, but that makes it more clear what I try to find out. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Which one, Sadia or Frans, you want to respond to this?
Well, the Dutch architect who stayed in Amsterdam, like the Amsterdam School architects like Michel de Klerk, Johan van der Meij, Piet Kramer, worked for Eduard Cuypers. And Eduard Cuypers went to Indonesia in 1909, and he fell in love with Indonesian art. So he gave a magazine, Indonesia Out and New, and he asked people to write about this Indonesian culture. And he had also a large library in his architectural office. So people who worked for him, these architects, could look in it. And they were inspired by mostly historical buildings, not by artists who made them. You know what I mean? Because you were talking about, are they in contact with Indonesian artists? No, it was inspired by ancient Hindu and Buddhistic architecture and traditional architecture like the Minangkabau and the Bataks. Is that?
Yes, thank you, Frans. And maybe Sadia respond to this.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like how I should respond to this. If artists did field work in Indonesia itself, yeah, I think there were definitely artists, like many artists also like were part of the colonial project too, right? Who came, for example, with Raffles or in these so-called like scientific expeditions, that there were very often artists that also traveled to the Indonesian archipelago to draw these monuments. Indeed, like, but due to the preoccupation with Hindu-Buddhist culture, that it was mainly the focus on temples like Borobudur and like Prambanan. So artists were in that sense also very much part and parcel of the colonial project and of gathering knowledge and of making the archipelago and the colonized land and people sort of like visible. So on the one hand, that is what happened. And then on the other hand, what you also see is that, for example, what the person that I discussed before, Hazel, who wrote a very influential book about Wayang and posed his thesis about Wayang as an ancestral ritual, and he became so famous and influential with it. And he wrote this book before he had ever even traveled to Indonesia. So on the one hand, there is a lot of like, this knowledge making and artist making of people about Indonesia, about Indonesian people, without even having ever been there, and then other people who would go to the Indonesian archipelago as part as the colonial project. Yeah, so maybe that is what I would like to add to this. But yeah, of course, yeah, there's a lot more to say. But okay, so far for now.
Thank you, Max, for your questions. I remember Pramudia Anantatur, the very famous Indonesian writer who never been to the Netherlands, but his books describe as if that he knows very well about the Netherlands. So it is possible without physical context, but probably the rest in the audience have opinions about that. About this, please go ahead. The next is from Schip van de Peppel. If you want to say yourselves, or shall I read it for you? Because it's nice also if you can mention. Please introduce yourself briefly.
Hello, thanks for the nice presentations from Frans and Ina. I'm a collector of graphics, and I also have a lot of graphics from the colonial period. What I saw was that, for instance, there's a painting number from the magazine Tourism in Netherlands, India, and it's full of beautiful paintings by Indonesian artists, and everybody is mentioned, the editor and every from the Dutch side who worked on the magazine is mentioned, but there's nowhere a credit for the painters who made these beautiful paintings. Nowadays they are called Mooi India style, and they are very wanted in the Netherlands and in Indonesia, I think. So I went on a search because they were signed in the paintings, and I found a few of them in Bandung, Bashir Ijonati and Adiwinata, two brothers. But it says something about the how do you say that? The verhoudingen, the way they work together. This they were good enough to give a lot of beautiful paintings, but the Dutch didn't even mention them in the magazine. And that says something about how the power difference were. That's just what I wanted to add it to the discussion.
Yes, I mean, what you have mentioned is enrich our discussions. Please, Frans, comment about this.
Yes, well, it's a shame, but it was like that. That was how the colony was. You know, there were the white people the first, then came the Indo people the second, and then came the people, the natives. It was like that. It was a very segregated society. It's a shame, but it was like that.
Yes, and that's why I have the feeling that we have to do something back, and we can write now about those artists and tell where they came from and what kind of art they made, just to show that they were very talented at the time.
Yeah, but we can't change it now. But we just can admit that it was wrong. It was done.
Yes.
Okay, Sadia, please. I think this strengthening your opinion about inequality.
Yes, but that's known. We know it. Colonization is like inequality.
Yeah, of course.
Imperialism.
Of course, it is the past. But let's connect it to the contemporary situations. Do you have a comment on this, Sadia, or you completely agree with Schip and no comment, Sadia?
No, I don't know. I think I stick to my previous argument. But I also feel like that many of the structures that were put in place by colonialism are still in place today, and maybe they've changed. Maybe they've changed in a way. Like Frans was saying, like for example, the racial hierarchy on which the colonial society was built. So maybe officially that doesn't exist anymore, but racism still exists. So in a way, we're still sort of like dealing with the legacies that colonialism has put in place. So I do feel like we also need to consider that, like colonialism is not something of the past. It's really also something still in the present.
I have to say that I agree with you, being someone who works internationally, dealing with cooperations between Indonesia and the Netherlands. So inequality still exists. I wouldn't say it's colonialism. I think it's too far. But I think Indonesia still has to work with the inferiority complex, which still heavily happen now. So I think being a country who was colonized for a long time, not only by the Netherlands, but also with other European countries, I noticed that in my daily work dealing with Indonesians, that everything come from the West is better. They always listen. So inferiority complex it exists, and we still have to deal with it. So I think that is what I can observe, and I'm sure that many of you in the webinar today dealing with international cooperations, especially with developing countries, probably have more or less experiences like this. I don't know, but let's see. Sadia has a stronger opinion about this, and I have to say. It's a pity that it's a gray, but I think it's a natural way of recovering as a country, as a young country, to deal with inferiority complex. Please share your opinions also, everybody in the room. Okay, unless you can raise your hand, there is an reactions there down under your Zoom screen. You can raise your hand, or you write down in the chat. There is a questions for both speakers, Frans and Sadia. Amsterdam School has mostly drawn on the Hindu-Buddhist symbols, art and architecture, while the majority of Java and Indonesia at large was and is Islamic. How can we explain the focus on Hindu-Buddhist sources instead of Islamic ones? Which one want to react first, Sadia or Frans? Let's start with Sadia, because we always start with Frans. Now we start with Sadia.
Go ahead, Sadia.
Okay, no, it's okay. I don't think we always start with Frans, but I'm happy to start. Well, actually, this is really interesting, and this is something that comes up quite often, like why this preoccupation with the Hindu-Buddhist past, while obviously the majority of Java was actually already Islamic. So this is also something that already starts with Raffles, for example, that he decided to focus on the Hindu-Buddhist part and create this discourse of the current present-day Islamic culture as a degenerate culture, which had negatively influenced the way in which culture had developed on the island. So that was therefore the reason why the Hindu-Buddhist heritage had to be protected first by the British, and then later on the Dutch actually also took on the same discourse. So I just actually wrote like an article about this, not just about this, but like about knowledge production in the 19th century, and also like why this preoccupation with the Hindu-Buddhist past of Java, while actually at the time the contemporaries were mostly Islamic and still are, which also had to do with the position of Europe itself within Europe, as opposed to, for example, the Ottoman Empire. So it was also it was basically a political decision as well to focus on the Hindu-Buddhist past and render Islam politically less important.
Frans, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's not true that it's only on Hindu and Buddhistic architecture. They also were inspired by Minangkabau and the Bataks in Sumatra, and also by the Torajas in Celebes. So that's not true what this gentleman say. It's all tradition. Also, the traditional architecture was an inspiration for the Amsterdam School.
Thank you, Frans, for the answer. And for the one who questions, you can always write down if you have more opinion about this.
Yeah, I would say go to the exhibition and you will see it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Frans, this is for you, the idea of cross-pollinations and visual influences that can be seen very clearly in the building designs. How much of the philosophies and spiritual values behind many of these Indonesian vernacular architecture are also taken into account by the Dutch? And what is your view on this?
Well, I told it already. You know, there was this First World War. Holland was neutral. And these architects, Michel de Clercq, Piet Kramer, and sculptors like Hilda Krop and John Wegener, they thought about the peace and freedom symbolism of Hindu and Buddhist religion. So they used inspiration from these two religions to have the people who live in Amsterdam or wherever where they made these their creations to give them a good feeling about it. So this is the spiritual behind using elements of Hindu and Buddhist architecture.
Thank you very much. Adis, would you like to have a comment on this? I believe because you live in Amsterdam, you also been to the exhibitions. So what is your impressions as a young generations Indonesian about these influence interactions, and also the reply from France?
Sorry, I don't know if my voice is still a bit echoey. I can't comment. Okay, I think I'm going to just write.
No problem. And then while you move maybe to other place which is not echoing, I can ask other participants. How many of you have been to the exhibitions, and what you think? What your opinions about the interactions between Indonesia and the Netherlands about this? Is there any volunteer? Please.
Schip van der Peppel.
Have you been to the exhibitions, Schipke?
Yes, I've been there recently, and I saw Frans there. And
okay, and then what is your opinion?
For me, it was very inspiring because I'm a collector of graphics and objects of art from that period, and I have a lot of objects in my collection which have a link with Indonesia and not knowing it. So that was very interesting to see. For instance, all the forms in the Amsterdam School, like the parabol. Yeah, I don't know the English name for it, but the parabol.
Parabolic form.
Parabolic form. That it came. I didn't know that it came from Indonesia, and the stupa and the towers. And for instance, I have a tobacco pot, which has the same form. And I've been in Indonesia myself for about 8 weeks for a study project when I was young. So I have a connection with the country, yeah, it was some kind of revelation to see that a lot of things that I like and that I collect because they are from a certain period also have a connection with Indonesia. So I found it very interesting and a beautiful expedition.
Thank you very much for sharing. And also probably it's interesting to know from the Indonesian participants, although you do not go to the exhibitions yet because you are in Indonesia, but probably after listening to this webinar and also receive informations about influence interactions between Indonesia and the Netherlands, what do you feel? What do you think as Indonesians? I saw some Indonesians in the room, so probably I will do like my teacher did in my elementary schools. In Indonesia, it's polite if we talk when we were asked. So it's not dictatorship, but that's the way how it works in Indonesia. So probably I saw Made Nuraya. Would you like to comment, please, if you don't mind?
Yes.
Yes, please. And could you introduce yourself for briefly? It's nice to know who you are.
Yes. Thank you very much, Ibu Hasti. Firstly, my name is Madina Raya. I am a student from Gajah Mada University, but also going in exchange semester at Leiden University. So I've been to the Netherlands, but currently not yet attending to exhibition, but still I'm not in the Netherlands. But I'm very, very looking forward to going to visit the exhibition, and that is why the interest of me in joining in today's discussion. And even though that I haven't been to the exhibition, but seeing the documentation of the architecture from the video from Dr. Fran's video, me as a young generation of Indonesian, and I'm also Balinese, seeing the house of the building that inspired by the naga of Bali.
Anna.
Yeah, Jempana of Bali. Me personally, and the Kayon, and it's quite at first impression it's quite impressive because it's cool, because it's good to know that Indonesian architecture, even though that it came from the unequal power relations, the context of colonial, even though that it came from the inspired from the Expo, still in the arguments of the colonial bubble still persist. It cannot undermine that the fact that the inspiration or the essence of the culture is inspired to the architecture. But in the first impression also, it's quite hard for me to think that it is inspired by the Naga, because I cannot really saw it until you explain that it is inspired by the lotus. This building inspired by the lotus or the Kayon, because, or the Naga, because it's, for me, it's still just a little bit of architecture that really not fully showing the lotus for me as the in Indonesian terms of awam, not knowing it the real in meaning of it until you explain. But that is the meaning of art. You have to digging up of the architecture until you really know about it. But still, I think for me, the young generation of Indonesian that visiting to the Netherlands and seeing the exhibition, I hope I can visit later. The most important thing is about the value behind, and also the recognition of the what Dr. Fellow the recognition of the colonial bubble behind it, and the injustice behind it, and also between the various perspectives that have lied behind in the architecture. So that is very nice for me. Thank you very much for having me in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Made. Yes, usually when we talk about the interactions between Indonesia and Netherlands, mostly so far, there's researchers focus on the influence of Netherlands in Indonesia. But now we talk the other way around. So I think even for me, I think for most Indonesians are new to know how much influence of Indonesia in the Netherlands. Thank you, Made. There is a question from Josep Hardela. Would you like to mention to say directly, please?
Yes, of course.
Please introduce yourself.
All right, my name is Joseph Gardella. I am a student in architectural history at the University of Groningen. And yeah, my question is about, well, to Dr. Leidenmeier. You introduced the meander motive during the project, discussing the project from the Basel.
Mm-hmm.
And this meander motive can also be seen in the works of Lauwerix, who I admire greatly. And why was this motive of such relevance for them? And how is it linked with theosophy?
Well, they're both theosophies, and they are very much inspired and interested in this Borobudur building. That's why they use it, the meander motif. You know, the movie you saw. This was just a part. There's a larger movie of it, and then I also show that in furniture, the Basel used this meander motif. I don't know the link between Theosophy and Buddhism, but Theosophy has a Buddhism background. That's why they are interested in this meander motif.
All right, thank you.
Probably you have done research yourself, Josep, and you can tell more about this. Why do you ask? Because I'm sure that you have a background knowledge about this. That's why you ask.
Yes, I'm writing my thesis about organic architecture and the link with anthroposophy also.
Yeah.
And Rudolf Steiner from anthroposophy has, of course, a relationship with theosophy, and Mathieu Lauwerix was head of the Theosophist organization. So it was
together with the Basel.
Yeah. Oh, together. Okay. Yeah.
They gave also a course in the old American school, the Vahana course, about theosophy. How you can design with the help of geometric skills.
Okay. The Vahana course. What is
Vahana.
Vahana. Thank you all.
Yeah, when you visit www.Schip museum@schip.nl, you can see when this documentary will be shown. I think it's on the 30th of April, and
Perfect.
then I will explain more about theosophy and things like that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Josep.
You're welcome very much.
Yes, and Sadia talk a lot about theosophy. Do you have something about this, or enough?
No, I think I'm good. Yeah.
You are good. Okay. Ruben Silitonga, we are so happy to have you in the webinar. Are you in a situation where you can speak directly, please, Ruben Silitonga?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, please.
Hello,
go
everyone.
ahead and please introduce yourself briefly.
Oh, yeah. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ruben Silitonga. I'm a student in Diponegoro University in Semarang. Well, actually, I'm just recently been interested with the Indonesian and the Dutch colonial past and history and art, and I'm just really curious because I'm a newbie. I don't know a lot of stuff that most of Franz and Sadia has been discussed before. So my question really is I'm just curious about the relationship and the perspective that the Dutch people in general knows or knows about the Indonesian art and its influence on the Dutch architecture and art, especially after the war and after the colonization. Is this if they're aware, if it's general knowledge, or it's only when the Dutch people really want to search about it. And especially for Sadia and for France, is there any big elements of whitewashing by the Dutch about the information and the influence and the credits that the Dutch tells its people? If you guys.
Thank you. Please go
Thank you
ahead,
so much.
Frans and Sadia.
I couldn't hear him what he really wants to know. It was
Okay.
very so clear.
Oh,
Maybe
yeah, okay.
Sadia,
I'll
please,
start.
start. Yes.
Okay, maybe I think because like you basically asked multiple questions in one question, but maybe I can share a little bit about like how Dutch maybe perceived Indonesian art from like if we think of art as, for example, like visual art, that we see that a lot of like the way in which Indonesian art is being received and perceived in the Netherlands is it follows kind of like political periods. So during the colonial period, that's why, for example, during the colonial periods, paintings by Raden Saleh ended up in the collection of the Colonial Museum, that is now Trophy Museum, or Walter Spies, or any of the sort of like the founding fathers of Indonesian art. Still ended up in colonial museums or so-called ethnographic or anthropological museums. And then after independence, you see that kind of like still sort of like follows also this political relationship as sort of like a struggle with like how to deal or how to look at Indonesian art from like a Dutch perspective in a way that sort of like tries to move away from these political relationship, but also is not entirely able to escape from it. So we see, for example, I think what we see now in what happens in a lot of museums, a lot of, for example, artistic interventions. So where the Indonesian artists are invited to respond to a collection, to respond to an exhibition, for example, at the Rijksmuseum, for example, at the Trophy Museum, etc. But still, so this is actually still within this realm of like trying to get rid of this colonial gaze and looking at the artist as a way out. So there is more, I think, in interactivity, and there is an attempt to sort of like move beyond this colonial gaze. And at the same time, we also see that that is very hard to, it is a very hard thing to achieve in the Netherlands and in the context of museums and exhibitions.
Thank you. It's a complicated and very wide discussions. But Ruben, we are happy that you, as a young generations of Indonesian who is studying, is interested in this topic, and probably in the future you can sharpen out your thought about this in a more discussion. Thank you very much, Ruben. Now we move to the next questions. Is this is about architecture of Minangkabau. Of course, it is for France, but I think it's also open for Sadia, especially also because now you live in Indonesia and you have more contacts with Indonesian situations. How can we explain the interest on Indonesian folk culture, for example, on vernacular architecture of the Minangkabau? What did artists and architects hope to find in it, and what kind of things did they projects? Wait a minute. It's the questions is disappear in my. Okay. Especially after the war. No, this is from Ruben, and then this one. Okay. What did artists and architects hope to find in it, and what kind of things did they projects on folk culture? So please go ahead, Frans.
Well, at first they liked the spectacular form of these Minangkabau houses, and that's why they want also to create something like there's a clock in the exhibition. They want to create something very special, so they made as inspiration, they took it from the Minangkabau houses. That's the main purpose.
So according to you, it's basically only
shape,
press.
the shape. They use it.
Press,
Actually,
yeah, the shape, by the shape.
You want to make a beautiful piece, and they saw these houses and they thought, Jesus, these spectacular rules, we can use it to make a clock of it.
So the influence is merely on the physical surface, let's say, not go deep into philosophical behind it. Sadia, do you have opinion about this?
Yeah, I think we can also look at it like in the larger sort of like context of why people, of why artists or scientists came to Indonesia. It's I think it was part of this interest in mapping the diversity of the archipelago. So an interest in like seeing what is here, what kind of like difference were here, and to sort of like start to understand those differences from, you know, a Dutch viewpoint, from a European viewpoint. So I think there is also something in that, because like what is the reason why they would go to Minangkabau? There is something in this curiosity about the diversity and the mapping of the Indonesian archipelago as well, and to map its differences and diversity. I think the other thing that I want to remark with regards to this question is that I really like the term vernacular architecture, but I'm less, I think, less of a fan of the term folk culture. I think this is also like tradition, a terminology that was created to sort of like render or create like cultural hierarchies in which European cultures would then sort of like be placed higher in the cultural hierarchy than as opposed to, for example, folk culture or traditional cultures.
Yes,
so
about this, but I also would like to go deeper into the ownership of culture. Several years ago, not long time ago, there was an exhibition in the Tropen museums about ownership of culture. That's telling about how some celebrities in the world adopting one cultures. From examples, a costume from India for very famous singers. I forgot of
Beyonce.
Beyonce, for examples. So it is an adoption of a cultures on the surface, only physical, while for the owners of the culture itself, in this case Indonesia, Minangkabau architecture has a very, very deep meaning, philosophical values, and they don't create something merely for the beauty of it, but for values. And they even have ceremonies and different kind of things. So of course we cannot expect that the Dutch will do the same or at the same level of understanding of the values. But talking about ownership of cultures, what do you think? Yeah, it's
I think this goes back to sort of like similarly to the question of cultural appropriation, like who has the right to appropriate what, or to work with what, or to wear a certain dress or dress style of someone else. And I think what is important, what I pointed out earlier, I think it's important to remember like the power relations and also, you know, the privilege that one has. So what is your place in society? Like this is also in connection to sort of like white privilege and things like that. Like who has the right to do something? Like, are you part of the particular culture that you want to wear the dress with? Is it being gifted to you? Is it a celebration of the culture, or what is the intention, but also what is your position in the world? Like, is it your right to actually wear that particular dress or to use that particular culture? Like, who is their consent in a way? So I think that is also, to come back to that, I do feel like we have to take that into account, the power relationships that are in place, and where are you in like these social and cultural hierarchies?
Yeah. Well, I think this adaptations is, now in some cities in Indonesia, they built even an Eiffel Tower of Paris. And they even built in some cities a Dutch city with windmills and canals to get impressions that they are in Amsterdam. So I think everybody something, and but yeah, it gives a very interesting sensations if you are the owner of that culture and you see that your culture is adopted in a very artificial way. Yeah, in
But, I want to say something too.
yes.
I've been in Indonesia to make the second part of this cross-pollination movie. And there are also architecture that is inspired by Minangkabau, like the Techno University in Bandung by Henri McLean Pont. And people in Indonesia are fond of it. They don't say, oh, it's cultural appropriation and things like that. They're proud that this Dutch architect has built this beautiful architecture. So what are we talking about? I think this is really woke to have this appropriation and things like that. It was done in those years. So what can we do now? Look at these pieces and think, oh, what a beauty and what a good inspiration. Be proud that the Dutch used Indonesian culture to make beautiful things. I'm proud that the Dutch used Indonesian things to make these beautiful architecture and artifacts.
Yes, yes. I think what that is also one of the missions of the exhibitions, that to show how much influence of
Be proud that the Indonesians are important.
Yes, yeah, we have Indonesians. And talking about Indonesians, Yogi Susatyo, would you like to say directly? Are you in the positions to do that? Please go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Yogi Susatyo. I'm currently a history student in University of Indonesia. Yeah, I want to say that I'm agree with Made, if I'm not wrong, about how our younger generations of Indonesians see their history, their past history in the colonialism, and how about their relations with Dutch colonialism in particular. I agree also with Mrs. Hasti comment about the inferiority complex about Indonesians. Yes, there is still the context where the Indonesians also see the Dutch as not the Dutch, maybe the Western as something advanced and much better than the Indonesians. So they refers always to the Western scholars about themselves, but in another occasion also they hate the Western's influence because they see them as a threat for their national identity. And I remember I worked also for a short period helping organizing a seminar about Dutch-Indonesian relations in Erasmus Heights back in 2022. And always the questions that always pop out is about what about our history. We talk much about mostly Dutch and Indonesian relations, but then always even is an Indonesians or there's a Dutch descendant will say, how but our history? So the problems I see here in Indonesian's history curriculum and also in history teaching is always there is political context in everything. So colonialism is always a black and white things rather than a grayish area. So because it is a complex situations, then we have to know that colonialism is a wrong thing, but we cannot see colonialism only in a political basis. So I see that maybe if we just try to create a more better dialogue with much kind of different approach in historical science, mostly like economic approach or social approach and architectural approach, we could manage to build a better understanding that's much more harmless to each other, because it will be more profitable for both of Indonesians and Dutch to know both each other rather than only think that Dutch always wrong and Indonesian was always also wrong in several contexts. I see that as latent problems in Indonesian discourse always. Maybe that's my
Thank you.
pendapat.
Thank you, Yogi. It's so enriching to hear opinions from everyone, also from you. Thank you, especially new insights about relationship between Netherlands and Indonesia. Thank you. And I would like to remind you, there is a reminding from Anita Halim about inputs, especially about the Amsterdam School in Indonesia with all the hashtags. So please read in the chat. And also, of course, if you want to say something, add something, ask something in the Dutch in the chat, is also possible. Indonesia, English, Dutch, all possible. Please go ahead. And there is Made.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Can I maybe respond to Yogi's remark?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, yeah. And first of all, also, I'm also proud to be woke. I have no problems with that. But to come back to Yogi's remark, I think what has turned out to be like a really useful concept for me, and I think is also a way out of sort of like getting stuck in colonialism, or to sort of like anti-colonialism, is for me the concept of coloniality and decoloniality. So coloniality gives us the chance to sort of like really look at the structures of unequal power balances, etc. This whole fabric that was put in place during the colonial period, but how it has transformed over time and how we still sort of like living with the legacies of that, such as racial hierarchies and inequality and things like that. But at the same time, it also provides us a way out. So that's the decolonial position and the decolonial attitude. And that's not a concept, and it's not just a theory, it's also like a praxis. So it's something that we all in this webinar can actually do ourselves. And that is to like really look at like these dynamics that were put in place by colonialism, but that we now have the chance to reject. So we can say like, we don't want that anymore. We don't want to be stuck in this, but at the same time, we also need to understand how it works in order to be able to reject it. So it's first like understanding what has been put in place, how it works, and then say like, okay, no, I don't want that anymore. I'm going to focus on something else. So and something else can be indeed like, I want to look at like indigenous knowledge, kearifan lokal, like what is there, what was here already before the colonial period, what has been rendered invisible or silent, what has been silenced by the dominant narrative of colonialism. Where can we hold on what was there before, and how can we like create new meanings for that, for us to create another future that does not have to look back to colonialism the whole time, but that we can create something new that was here before, and that we create and develop into something new and meaningful for the rest of for this century. So it's about, you know, understanding how the past worked, but also how we can move away from that for a more equal future.
Well, I think you have some followers, Sadia, of being woke. In the chat, it's interesting. No, I mean, that's a very interesting discussion. And the beautiful things of this webinar is we can say our opinion without judgment. Everyone is free to be themselves and to have opinion. So I loved it. I think it's a matter of society, because we have only 7 minutes. I apologize that I will read quickly the questions which come to the chat. So I will not ask you to say more. For example, from Ibu Lani Prajaraharja, she missed the presentations analysis from the Indonesians on cultural soil, but that comes in the next webinar. So the third webinar, the speakers will be from Indonesia, Ibu Lani. So please join. We have 5 webinars related to the exhibitions, and this is only the second. So today is from east to the west, and the third webinar is from the west to the east. So please go ahead. And Robin Silitonga also again a comment about this. Thank you very much. We still have 5 minutes, and I think it's nice to wrap up this by asking the 2 speakers about closing statement is a big word, but I mean, you have a chance to say something before we end up the webinar. Frans, go ahead.
Well, I'm proud that the Dutch architects were inspired by Indonesian culture and that they made such a beautiful architecture, but also applied art. And I have several pieces in my collection and that are on display at the exhibition. And I'm also proud that they made a documentary about it, about this cross-pollination. And I just came back in September. I was filming in Indonesia, and we filmed in Jakarta, in Bandung, where I was born, in Cirebon, in Semarang, and in Surabaya, and in Kediri. And we filmed there colonial architecture made by Dutch, Indo-Dutch, and Indo-Chinese architects. And everywhere where we went, in every big city, there are cultural heritage societies run by Indonesians, and they are very happy with this cultural heritage, this shared cultural heritage. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Frans. Sadia.
As a final something?
Yes. Closing and or your feeling whatever about webinar, but last chance.
No, I think what I said before, I think I just want to make that point, you know, this idea of coloniality and decoloniality, like I do feel it's really important to understand our past like very deeply and to really understand how it has created the world in which it is today, but also including, you know, also the dark pages of history, the dark side of it, that we understand where it comes from so that we are also able to change that for like a better future, for like a more equal future in which maybe we could be in a world where there are no racial inequalities, for example. And and all of that, like the dark pages, we do have to recognize. And of course, it also, there's also a lot of like beautiful things in the world. And I don't mean to disrespect any of that, but I do feel we need to have the full picture of how history works in order to be able to move forward into a better one.
Yes, thank you very much. And webinar like this, discussions, no matter how simple and how short it is, it's always contribute to bridge the two worlds. I think that's a lot of works. And being someone who work in a relationship of both countries in cultural heritage, and I think there are many of you in the webinar now also do something like me, bridging Indonesia and Netherlands in your own way. Realize that there are many things to be done to create understanding to each other. It's a lot to be done. It's a beautiful word to understand each other, but it's so difficult to realize, especially when it comes to the difficult situations. Yeah, Frans smile a little bit. I think he understand completely. Everybody completely understand. Thank you for Enike Santosa for your comments, beautiful comment in the chat. Everybody can read it themselves. Anita, do you have announcements for the next webinar or the webinar series?
Yeah, for the next webinar, we have the topic of Amsterdam School in Indonesia, and then we will have two Indonesian speakers, Setiadi Sopandi from Arsitektur.Indonesia.org and Pak Johannes Widodo from NUS. So yeah, and we're gonna have the Indonesian perspective of Amsterdam School, and we're inviting you all to come and see the webinar next month.
Yeah,
I will.
Thank you. And for those who need certificates, please contact Museum Head Schip because they distribute the certificates. I would like to thank you everyone, Frans Ledemeyer and Dr. Sadia Bonstra for your time and knowledge and experience to share with us. I would like to thank everybody who already allocated time in this beautiful sunny day in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and also beautiful evening for us to join these conversations. And I think this is a beautiful thing that we do together to understand each other, to have conversations. And the next webinar will be announced on social media, and you can always check on the websites of Museum Headscapes. And I think on behalf of the team of Museum Headscapes and all the volunteers, I would like to thank you all, and a very good evening in Indonesia and a very good afternoon in the Netherlands. See you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Asti. Thank you, Mela.
If you
Thank you,
still want to
Anita.
have questions or whatever, just contact them.
Terima kasih, terima kasih.
Terima
Thank you,
kasih
El.
semuanya,
Terima
sama-sama.
kasih.
Selamat malam.
Thank you.
Bye.
Until next time. Bye.
Sampai jumpa.
Sampai jumpa.